The date is October 25th, 1944. Off the northeastern tip of Luzon, a Japanese aircraft carrier is dying. She is the Zuikaku, the last fleet carrier from the Pearl Harbor Strike Force. The last ship that was there at the beginning, still afloat at what will be the end. As she goes under, her crew lines the deck one final time. They stand at attention. They sing the national anthem. The flag is lowered, and then the sea takes her. On the bridge of a nearby cruiser, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa watches. He had sailed into this battle knowing that his ships would be sunk. The mission required it. He had sent 76 aircraft into the sky that morning, the last carrier-borne strike the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever launch, specifically to attract American attention, to make certain the enemy found him, to make certain the enemy chased him. The plan worked perfectly. Here is the question I keep returning to, sitting with this battle for as long as I have. What does it feel like to succeed at your own destruction? To watch everything you built, every ship you commanded, every young pilot you sent off a flight deck, go under the water, exactly as planned. Ozawa reportedly wept. Then he considered whether he should follow his ships down. He did not. And I'm not sure that was the easier choice. The Battle of Leyte Gulf lasted 4 days. It covered 100,000 square miles of sea. It involved over 200,000 men. It was, by every credible measure, the largest naval battle in the history of the world. And it was decided, ultimately, not by the biggest guns or the most ships. It was decided by 3 men making 3 decisions they could not take back. A note before we continue. This is an educational history documentary. The events described are real. The language is specific because the subject demands it. The narration you hear is AI-generated. The script, research, and all editorial decisions are human-authored. Historical photographs and archival materials come from the U.S. National Archives, the USMC Historical Archive, and the Library of Congress. All sources are public domain and listed in full in the description below. If you're finding value in this documentary, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this old grumpy to keep producing videos like this. Now, back to the story. Before we get to the admirals and the warships, we need to spend a moment with a promise. On the 11th of March, 1942, in the dead of night, a PT boat slipped away from the island fortress of Corregidor in the Philippines. On board was General Douglas MacArthur, commander of American and Filipino forces in the Pacific. Behind him, 76,000 of his soldiers remained, surrounded, outgunned, awaiting what everyone understood would be a Japanese assault that would end in surrender or death. MacArthur had been ordered out by President Roosevelt. He did not go willingly. When his boat reached the southern Philippines and he transferred to an aircraft for Australia, he made a statement to the press that would define the next 2.5 years of his life. He said, "I came through, and I shall return. I shall return. Not we shall return. Not the United States shall return. I." It was a personal oath, and everyone who heard it understood it as such. MacArthur, the most theatrical American general since Patton, and frankly more theatrical than Patton, had made his reputation and his honor hostage to the Philippines. He would spend the next 30 months fighting the bureaucratic and strategic battles of his career to ensure that the return would happen, that it would be through the Philippines specifically, and that he would be the man who led it. He was not without opposition. Admiral Chester Nimitz and much of the Navy's leadership believed the correct strategic path bypassed the Philippines entirely. Strike for Formosa, cut off Japan's supply lines, end the war faster. MacArthur argued, loudly, repeatedly, and ultimately successfully, that America owed the Filipino people its return, and that abandoning that obligation would be a moral catastrophe. In July 1944, MacArthur met with President Roosevelt and Admiral Nimitz in Hawaii. He brought maps. He brought arguments. He brought 30 years of accumulated force of personality. He got his Philippines. The invasion was set for October 1944. The landing beach would be Leyte. And that decision, one general's insistence on keeping a personal promise, is why the largest naval battle in history happened where it did, when it did, with everything it cost. By the autumn of 1944, Japan was losing a war it could not afford to lose and could no longer win. The mathematics were brutal. The United States was producing a new warship roughly every 48 hours. Japan was producing one ship to every 10 American vessels. The trained pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had ravaged the Indian Ocean and torn apart Allied forces at Midway, most of them were dead, killed in the attrition of 2 years of Pacific combat. What remained, in the fall of 1944, was the metal, the hulls, the guns, the armor. The knowledge that powered those hulls was largely gone. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, understood this precisely. He also understood something else. The Philippines were not merely a strategic position, they were a choke point. If the Americans took the Philippines, Japan's supply line from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the fuel that kept every aircraft, every ship, every tank moving, would be severed. The home islands would starve. The war would end, not in a negotiated peace, but in collapse. Toyota looked at his charts. He looked at what remained of his fleet, and he conceived a plan of extraordinary complexity and borderline desperation. It would split the Japanese Navy into 4 separate forces. It would require perfect coordination across hundreds of miles of ocean, with communications that were already proving unreliable. It would demand that one of his finest admirals sail knowingly to his death. I want to be clear about something the traditional telling of this battle sometimes obscures. This plan, Operation Sho-Go, Victory Operation 1, was not a gesture of defiance or a death wish. The men who designed it genuinely believed it could work. It was audacious. It required luck. It required Halsey to be exactly as aggressive and exactly as uncautious as he had always been. But it was not crazy. And that, I think, makes what happened next both more remarkable and more devastating. The plan had 4 pieces. Kurita's center force, 7 battleships including the 2 largest ever built, would come from the west, through the Philippine Islands, and emerge at Leyte Gulf to destroy MacArthur's invasion fleet. Nishimura's southern force and Shima's second strike force would approach from the south through Surigao Strait, striking the 7th Fleet from below. And Ozawa, the most capable carrier Admiral Japan possessed, would take his empty carriers north and sacrifice them as bait to pull Halsey's 3rd Fleet away and leave Leyte's northern flank unguarded. Each piece of this plan depended on every other piece. The coordination required would strain any navy in optimal conditions. The Imperial Japanese Navy in October 1944 was not in optimal conditions. It was a plan that needed everything to go right, and almost nothing did. Jisaburo Ozawa stood 6 feet 7 inches tall in a navy where the average officer stood 5 foot 6. His face was so severe, so unexpectedly gaunt, that his men called him Gargoyle, never to his face, but with something that was close to affection. He was, by the consensus of his peers and his enemies alike, perhaps the finest naval mind Japan produced in the Second World War. He had pioneered the doctrine of carrier warfare that Japan used to devastate Pearl Harbor. He had built the strike formations that swept the Indian Ocean in 1942. He had fought at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the catastrophe known to Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and watched his air groups annihilated in a single afternoon. He knew, better than anyone, what remained. 116 aircraft spread across 4 carriers. Not because Japan hadn't tried to train more pilots, they had. But the training pipeline had been crushed under 2 years of attrition, and the fuel shortage had made even basic flight training nearly impossible. The men who flew off his decks in October 1944 had roughly 1/3 the flight hours of the men who had struck Pearl Harbor. Ozawa was ordered to take these carriers north, to deliberately break radio silence, to launch his aircraft, all of them, not to attack, but to be seen, to attract American radar and American scouts, to pull Halsey's 1,000-plane fleet over the horizon and leave Leyte exposed. He was also ordered to expect complete destruction. In his post-war interrogation, an American officer asked Ozawa directly, did he believe his mission could succeed? Ozawa answered with one sentence. He said he had not much confidence in being a lure, but there was no other way. That sentence has stayed with me. There was no other way. It's the kind of thing a man says when he has already finished the argument with himself, when the rational part of him that knows this is a terrible idea has been overruled by the part that serves something larger than his own survival. I don't romanticize this. I don't think Ozawa wanted to die, but I think he had reached the place where wanting and deciding had become separate things. On October 20th, as MacArthur's soldiers were wading ashore at Leyte, as Douglas MacArthur was completing his promise to return to the Philippines in the most theatrical manner an American general has ever managed, Ozawa's force left the Japanese inland sea and turned south. Behind him, the home islands. Ahead, the sea he was meant to die in. He had sent his aircraft to attract the enemy. The enemy wasn't watching. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita left Brunei on October 22nd with the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. At the center of the formation, visible from miles away even in the pre-dawn gray, the 2 super battleships, Yamato and Musashi, each displacing over 70,000 tons, each carrying 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval weapons ever placed on a warship. There was nothing like them in the world. Kurita was a battleship admiral in the truest sense, a man who had spent his career around large guns and heavy armor, who understood power expressed in steel and range. He had been skeptical of the Sho-Go plan before it began. He had been quietly vocal among his senior staff about his reservations regarding sending the fleet to attack troop transports rather than the American carrier forces he considered the real target. But he was a Navy man. He went. At dawn on October 23rd, in the Palawan Passage, 2 American submarines found him. USS Darter and USS Dace struck in the night darkness. In less than 30 minutes, Kurita lost 2 heavy cruisers, the Otago and the Maya, both gone under. A third, Takao, was torn open by torpedoes and forced back to Singapore trailing oil. The Otago was Kurita's own flagship. He went into the water. He was pulled out by a destroyer and transferred his flag to Yamato, the largest ship in the world, now carrying an admiral who had just lost his flagship and watched men he knew drown in waters he could touch. I think this moment matters more than most accounts give it credit for. Kurita was 60 years old. He had been in the water. He spent the next 3 days on the bridge of Yamato, in continuous combat, watching ships die around him. Historians have argued for 80 years about what happened in his mind on October 25th. I think part of the answer starts here, in the cold water off Palawan, before the battle had officially begun. The next day was worse. 5 American carrier task groups hammered the center force through the Sibuyan Sea in 5 separate waves. 300 aircraft, then more aircraft. The Japanese had no air cover. The promised land-based planes from Luzon never materialized. They had already been burned up in 2 weeks of preliminary fighting over Formosa. The Musashi absorbed everything. 17 bomb hits, 19 torpedo strikes, 36 total impacts against a ship designed to absorb perhaps a third of that. She listed. She flooded. Her captain attempted to beach her. She capsized at 7:35 in the evening, taking over 1,000 men into the Philippine Sea. The largest warship Japan had ever built, gone in a single afternoon. At 4 p.m., under the weight of what he was facing, no air cover, 1 super battleship gone, 2 cruisers from the morning now added to the count, constant attack. Kurita turned around. He radioed Combined Fleet Headquarters. They were reversing course. The order that came back from Admiral Toyota read, "With confidence in heavenly guidance, the entire force will attack." Kurita turned around again. At 5:15 p.m., he pointed the fleet east, back toward San Bernardino Strait, back toward the mission. Whatever had broken in him for those 90 minutes, he had put it back together, or had put something back together. But a man can only be glued back together so many times before the seams start to show. William Frederick Halsey was called Bull, a nickname he hadn't chosen, but had come to inhabit completely. He was 62 years old, combative, impatient, the kind of admiral whose career had been built on aggression and whose instincts had been rewarded enough times that he'd stopped questioning them. He had been publicly associated 6 months earlier at the Philippine Sea with the argument that Spruance's methodical caution had been excessive. Halsey had been explicit about what he would have done differently. Now he had Japanese carriers in his sights. I've wrestled with Halsey for a long time. He wasn't stupid. He was one of the most decorated officers in the American Navy. He knew, intellectually, that those carriers might be a decoy. Several of his own officers told him precisely that. Vice Admiral Lee, commanding the fast battleships, sent him a direct signal. The Japanese carriers were probably bait. Rear Admiral Bogan called his flagship, told them Kurita had turned back east. A staff officer picked up. Yes, we have that information," the officer said, and dismissed it. Halsey either never saw that report or saw it and overwrote it. I can't tell you which is worse. Ozawa had broken radio silence. He had launched every aircraft he had. He had done everything short of firing a flare and hanging a sign. At 4:40 p.m. on October 24th, American reconnaissance planes spotted the northern force northeast of Luzon. Halsey's reaction was immediate. He called his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Robert Carney. He pointed to the position on the chart. He said, "Here's where we're going. Start them north. Every ship, the entire Third Fleet. 3 carrier task groups, the fast battleships, everything." Behind him, San Bernardino Strait, unguarded, dark, open, and Kurita, at 20 knots, already heading toward it. He had given Ozawa exactly what Ozawa had bargained his life for. While Kurita and Ozawa were writing their chapters of this story, a third force was advancing toward its own appointment. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded what the plan called the Southern Force. 2 old battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers. His assignment was to enter Leyte Gulf through Surigao Strait from the south, simultaneously with Kurita's arrival from the north, in a classic pincer that would destroy the American 7th Fleet between 2 fires. There is a detail about Nishimura that I find haunting, and that most histories of Leyte bury in a footnote. He knew. He had read the plan. He understood that his 2 old battleships were not going to achieve anything decisive against a modern American battle line. He understood that Kurita's coordination with him was essentially impossible given the distances and the communications. He advanced anyway. His men noted, in the days before the battle, that he seemed at peace in a way he hadn't been before. I think he had made his peace. What waited for Nishimura in Surigao Strait was the last battleship action in history, and one of the most asymmetric. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had positioned his fleet across the northern end of the strait. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, in a perfect crossing of the T. The classic naval formation where the attacker advances in column and can only fire forward guns, while the defender fires full broadsides. Every gun in the American fleet against the few guns Nishimura could bear. The battleship Fuso was struck by American torpedoes first. She broke in half. Both pieces continued to burn and drift for an hour before sinking separately. 2 halves of a ship floating in opposite directions in the dark. Nishimura pressed on into the American line with what remained. His flagship Yamashiro was hit by 2 battleships' broadsides simultaneously. She capsized and sank. Nishimura went down with her. Shima's follow-on force arrived, found the wreckage of Nishimura's fleet burning in the water, and turned back. The southern approach was closed, sealed in fire and in the bodies of Japanese sailors floating in a Philippine strait. The pincer that was supposed to destroy the American fleet had lost one of its arms. There is a story inside the Battle of Leyte Gulf that exists almost on a different scale from the Admiral's decisions and the strategic calculus. It is the story of a Cherokee destroyer captain from Pawnee, Oklahoma, and the morning he pointed his ship at the most powerful battle fleet in Japanese history and pushed the throttles to flank speed. Ernest Edwin Evans was commissioned in 1931, the son of a Navy family, the grandson of a man who had fought in the Civil War. He had been at Pearl Harbor. He had spent 3 years in the Pacific in destroyers, thin-hulled, lightly armed, built for speed and torpedoes, not for absorbing battleship fire. When the Johnston was commissioned in October 1943, Evans spoke to his crew at the ceremony. The words became, in later years, the sentence by which naval historians remember him. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." On the morning of October 25, 1944, the Johnston was operating with Taffy 3, Task Unit 77.4.3, a group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts assigned to provide close air support for the Leyte landings. These were not the fast fleet carriers. They were converted merchant ships, slow and lightly armored, their flight decks wooden. Their escort, the Johnston, the Hole, the Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, carried torpedoes and 5-inch guns. Against cruisers and battleships, a 5-inch gun is a gesture. Against the Yamato's 18.1-inch main battery, a 5-inch shell is an insult. At 6:44 a.m., the radar operators on Taffy 3 detected the masts of Japanese warships on the horizon. Then the Japanese opened fire, and the shells that arrived were dyed red, yellow, blue, the colorants Japan used to distinguish which ship's salvos were which in a fleet engagement. The sea around the escort carriers erupted in colored shell splashes. The men of Taffy 3 had been asleep 20 minutes earlier. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, immediately ordered his carriers to run south, to launch everything they had, to make smoke. And then he ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts forward. The destroyer's mission was to buy time, to absorb the enemy's attention with torpedoes and gunfire and maneuver, to die usefully. Ernest Evans did not wait for the order to be repeated. The Johnston turned toward the Japanese fleet alone, before any other destroyer had moved, before the formal attack order had been issued, on Evans's personal decision and no other authority. She pushed to 30 knots. In the smoke and spray of the Pacific morning, a 2,100-ton destroyer charged directly at a fleet that included 4 battleships and multiple cruisers, vessels that outweighed her by 10 times, 50 times, 100 times. She hit the heavy cruiser Kumano with 10 5-inch shells. Then the torpedo battery went. 10 torpedoes into the cruiser's bow, detonating with a blast that blew the Kumano's bow clean off and forced her out of the battle. The battleship Congo was narrowly missed. Then the Yamato noticed the Johnston. 3 18.1-inch shells hit simultaneously. Then 3 6.1-inch shells from the secondary battery. One of the 18.1-inch rounds went through the engine room. Another destroyed the aft torpedo mount. A 6.1-inch shell hit the bridge, detonating among the officers, and blew 2 fingers off Evans's right hand. Evans refused painkillers. He directed all medical attention to the wounded crew. He kept fighting. For the next 2 hours, the Johnston, joined by the Hole and Heermann and the destroyer escorts, engaged in a running battle against an armada that should not have been stoppable by anything they carried. The Johnston ran through all her torpedoes. She switched to 5-inch guns. She drew fire away from the carriers. She charged a Japanese destroyer squadron that was attempting to torpedo the escort carriers and turned them back with gunfire. The Japanese sailors, watching her, concluded she must be a heavy cruiser. So sustained was her fire, so relentless her attacks. At 9:45 a.m., with both engines knocked out, her topsides destroyed, her communications gone, the Johnston was dead in the water. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. He was last seen on deck, still issuing orders, as the crew went into the water. He was never recovered. As the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze passed the sinking Johnston to confirm her death, her captain, Commander Terauchi Masamichi, came to the rail. The crew of the Yukikaze lined up. The commander saluted. Survivors in the water saw Evans on a lifeboat, saluting back, tears on his face. The Johnston sank at 10:10 a.m. I have read the Medal of Honor citation for Ernest Evans many times, and I always get to the same place. The moment a Japanese destroyer captain stops to salute the man he's just killed. That act tells you something about the nature of what happened off Samar on October 25, 1944. Something that transcends the strategic analysis and the Admiral debates. An enemy paid his respects because what Evans did was so far beyond what the situation required that it demanded acknowledgement. Not as an American, as a human being who chose something at cost that other humans recognized as rare. Rear Admiral Nimitz wrote that the defense of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. He was not a man given to hyperbole. At 9:11 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had what he had been sent to get: the destruction of Taffy 3, Evans and the tin can sailors charging into his fleet, the smokescreens, the aircraft with no ammunition making dry attack runs on his cruisers, had slowed him. But he was still there. He had 4 battleships. He had cruisers. The San Bernardino Strait was behind him, open. Leyte Gulf was 90 miles ahead. In that Gulf, MacArthur's invasion, the transports, the logistics ships, the landing craft, the fuel and ammunition for 130,000 soldiers, sat essentially undefended. Kincaid's heavy ships were far to the south at Surigao. Halsey was chasing Ozawa hundreds of miles to the north. The door was open. At 12:36 p.m., Kurita turned north. He was not turning toward Leyte Gulf. He was turning away from it. The reasons he gave, then in post-war interrogations, in fragmented accounts that his own chief of staff characterized as battle fatigue and poor communications, were contradictory and incomplete. He believed, wrongly, that there was an American carrier task force to the north of him. A false report. A phantom fleet that didn't exist. He had received no word from Nishimura's southern force, which had been annihilated at Surigao 3 hours earlier. He didn't know Ozawa's decoy had worked, that Halsey was gone, that the strait was clear. He had spent 72 hours watching his fleet die around him and knew from a reconnaissance report that Leyte Gulf itself contained 35 transports, not the loaded invasion anchorage he had been told to expect, but a depleted harbor where the critical ships had already unloaded and dispersed. An American officer who interrogated Kurita after the war found him cooperative but evasive, giving brief answers, somewhat on the defensive, his account of the critical hours inconsistent and difficult to reconcile with the known timeline. One Japanese veteran, a survivor of the battle who served under Kurita, told a journalist 60 years later, in English for emphasis, "I hate him. He was a coward." Another historian, after weeks interviewing the surviving Japanese officers, came away convinced that Kurita had done the right thing, that he had recognized a lost cause and refused to send thousands more men to die for a target that could no longer be decisive. I don't know who is correct. I'm not sure the categories of cowardice and courage are adequate to what happened on that bridge. What is documented, Kurita turned north. He searched for the Phantom Carrier Force for nearly an hour. He found nothing. He then turned south again toward the strait, not toward Leyte Gulf, but toward retreat. He was back through San Bernardino Strait and heading west before Halsey's ships, racing south, could intercept him. The door had been open for several hours. He had walked to the threshold and turned away. The Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, fired her guns at Leyte Gulf once, at extreme range, at targets she couldn't hit. Then she went home. She survived the battle. She did not survive the war. By evening of October 25th, the result was clear. Ozawa had lured Halsey north. He had sacrificed all 4 of his carriers, the Zuikaku, the Zuiho, the Chitose, the Chiyoda, and dozens of aircraft and thousands of men. His ships had been systematically hunted and destroyed by Halsey's squadrons through the long day off Cape Engano. He had done exactly what he was ordered to do. Ozawa watched from a cruiser as the Zuikaku went down, the carrier that had launched the strike on Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier, the ship that had been with the Imperial Japanese Navy through every phase of the war, now sliding under the Philippine Sea on a bright October afternoon. As she went under, her surviving crew performed the final ceremony. Attention, the national anthem, the flag lowered. There is something about the Zuikaku going down that I find almost unbearable. Not because of the tactics or the strategy, but because of what she represented. She was the last thread of continuity to the Japan that thought it could win. The Japan that launched a surprise attack and expected the United States to accept a negotiated peace, to recognize Japanese dominance in the Pacific. All of that had been settling slowly to the bottom of the ocean for 3 years. The Zuikaku was the last piece. When she went under on October 25, 1944, it was over. Not just the battle, but the idea. Ozawa, standing on the deck of a cruiser watching her sink, was watching something that his side had done to itself, long before Halsey found him. Ozawa reportedly considered suicide after the loss. A fellow officer dissuaded him with an argument that has the quality of being both true and devastating. You are the only Japanese admiral at Leyte Gulf who completed his assigned mission. He lived until 1966. He became an advisor to the post-war Japanese Defense Agency. He gave extensive, candid interviews to American historians. He refused promotion to full admiral and remained a vice admiral until the final dissolution of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. He had sacrificed his fleet to save an invasion that Kurita then refused to destroy. MacArthur had landed. He had returned to the Philippines as he swore he would, and the invasion, though it would be months before the island was secured, through brutal land fighting that would kill tens of thousands more, had survived its most dangerous day. On October 20th, as his landing craft neared the shore and the water was too shallow for the boat to reach the beach, MacArthur had waded in. The photograph taken at that moment became one of the most famous of the entire Pacific War. Some of his staff thought it was staged, that he had asked to be photographed, had arranged for the shot. MacArthur, when asked, said he hadn't staged it. What he actually said was, "But I would have if I'd thought of it." That is, I think, the truest thing Douglas MacArthur ever said about himself. On the same day that Kurita turned north and Ozawa's carriers burned and Evans's crew sang in the water, something else was happening over Leyte Gulf. A Japanese aircraft, a Zero carrying a bomb, piloted by a young man who would not be returning, dove deliberately into the flight deck of the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The St. Lo exploded. She was the first American warship to be sunk by what the Japanese called kamikaze, the divine wind. The technique had been used before, sporadically, by individual pilots. But the St. Lo marks the first organized, deliberate kamikaze strike, the formal beginning of a tactic that would kill thousands of American sailors in the months ahead, that would require the United States to absorb staggering human cost just to approach the Japanese home islands. The kamikaze is where the Battle of Leyte Gulf connects to the war's final horror. Japan's navy was finished. The battle proved it, definitively and beyond argument. But the men who would have crewed those ships didn't disappear. They became the pilots who dove into American flight decks at Okinawa, the soldiers who died rather than surrender on every island, the architects of a resistance so total that American planners estimated 1 million casualties for an invasion of Honshu. The battle that ended the Japanese fleet was also the moment Japan decided it would die rather than accept defeat. And that decision, made not in a single conference room, but in 1,000 small choices across the Philippines in October 1944, was going to cost everyone enormously before it was over. The Japanese Navy never again operated as a strategic force. Kurita's surviving ships returned to their bases with no fuel to sortie again. Ozawa was right. There was no other way. Japan had gambled the last hand it had to play, and lost. The largest naval battle in history ended without resolving the war. It only clarified what the war would cost to finish. There is a certain kind of history that wants to tell you who was right. Halsey, who chased the Decoy, right or wrong. Kurita, who turned away from the open door, coward or rationalist. Ozawa, who sailed knowingly into his own destruction, hero or victim. I don't think the questions are answerable in those terms. Kurita lived until 1977. He spoke about Leyte Gulf in fragmented, unsatisfying ways for 30 years and never gave a complete account. His post-war interrogators noted he appeared on the defensive. His surviving sailors split between contempt and loyalty. He spent his final decades in a house in southern Japan, and when the question of Leyte Gulf came up, he said what he said and was not more forthcoming than that. Ozawa became, in some sense, the most respected Japanese commander of the entire Pacific War. Respected because he accepted the worst assignment, executed it without illusion, and then spent the rest of his life being honest about it with the men who had defeated him. What I keep returning to is Evans. Not because his story is the easiest, it isn't. He died. His ship went down. He was pulled out of the water and he was never found. But because his decision is the clearest. He had a ship with thin walls and 5-inch guns, and he pointed it at something that should have killed him immediately, and he kept going until it did. He didn't deliberate. He didn't consider the strategic calculus. He thought about the men on those escort carriers and what would happen to them if nobody moved, and he moved. There is something in that, something that has nothing to do with military doctrine or the debate over Halsey's orders or Kurita's psychology, that I find worth sitting with. The USS Johnston was found on the seafloor in 2019 at a depth of 21,000 feet, the deepest wreck ever discovered. She was intact enough that her hull number, 557, was visible on the bow. Ernest Evans is still down there, along with 186 of his crew. And the Japanese destroyer captain who saluted them, his name was Terauchi Masamichi, lived until after the war, and when American historians interviewed him about that morning, he confirmed it. He had saluted. He saw no reason not to. Thank you for watching. If this is the kind of history you're looking for, subscribe. There's always another story waiting. The next documentary starts right after this one.